Welcome back to D&D Beyond, and I am very excited today because I have gathered, in my opinion, the expert panel of all expert panels to talk with me all about Spelljammer Adventures in Space and, oh yeah, actual space. So to give me all of those beautiful details, I have with me our own game design architect, along with project lead and co-writer for Spelljammer Adventures in Space. Please welcome back Chris Perkins. How are you today?
Hi, splendid. Thank you.
Along with two very, very special guests to the channel, please welcome from the Exoplanet Exploration Program Office at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Jennifer Burt.
Hey there, nice to be here.
Along with from the NASA Exoplanet Archive Project, Jessie Christiansen. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here.
So I threw those titles out because they are very, very fun to say, but I would love to hear briefly, Jennifer, what is it that you generally do? And if you would, what is your personal feeling about Dungeons & Dragons?
Ooh, sure. So I spend my days searching for new planets, so planets around other stars, we call exoplanets, and I do that with a whole variety of ground-based telescopes that are spread all over the world, so it's a ton of fun. I get to travel a little bit, get to become nocturnal on a regular basis to look at the stars at night, and then I also help to support the broader exoplanet community in providing more resources via NASA for their own investigations, their own attempts to follow up and confirm planets. Favorite aspects of D&D? Ooh, the character creation part honestly is so much fun, and just there are so many options to choose from, so I get a little carried away with what combinations are feasible. And yeah, thinking about what new places my character is going to explore, in the same way I think about which new stars we're going to explore.
So yeah, like Jen, I'm a planet hunter. I look for new planets. I'm also the project scientist at NASA's Exoplanet Archive, which is how NASA keeps track of all of the exoplanets that the scientists have found. So I'm the keeper of the keys at the archive, and I get to choose all the planets that go in, which is a lot of fun. In terms of D&D, the character creation, I agree, is really fun because there's not a lot of times in life where I just get to rage. And so I really love it in D&D when I just get to rage, and it's so cathartic.
Chris, for folks who might not be familiar with you, what does it mean to be an architect at the D&D studio, and what's your favorite thing about space?
Well, as one of the architects of D&D, it's my job to sort of be a steward of the brand and to kind of make sure that our game is speaking to the community that we have and evolving the game as time goes on, so that people just love it, continue to love it the way they do today. And then my feelings of space are I'd love to get up there sometime and actually find out what it's really like. But until that happens, I'll just make a bunch of stuff up about it. And some of that stuff is going to be based on my belief that it's always fun to live in a magical multiverse. And so magic is the thing I lean on to explain why my versions of space are different from everybody else's.
Jen, is this the part where we tell them that we make it all up as well?
I have suspicions, but I didn't want to actually accuse anybody. One of the interesting things about our version of space in D&D, what we call Wildspace, is it was inspired palette-wise by overexposed Hubble Space Telescope images. You know how they're always super vibrant nebula and all that kind of thing? You can't see that with the naked eye, but thanks to our modern telescopes and whatnot, we're seeing all these breathtakingly beautiful images. Those are what we handed off to the artists and said, make our space look like that.
Oh, I love that.
Make it pretty.
What's out there? What can we, because 30 years ago when they were doing Spelljammer for the first time, exoplanets were just a cool idea, I think. This is my understanding, that we were hoping we would eventually start to find, like maybe they're out there. So we've come a long way since then, because you have an entire catalog of them now. Can you tell me a little bit about what we find out there and maybe what that might inspire us for with our wild space systems?
Sure. So actually 30 years is a really good number to throw out there because it's 30 years ago this year that we found the first exoplanets, the first planets around other stars. And since then, we found over 5,000 confirmed worlds. And one of the coolest things about them is how almost none of the planets we found so far look like the planets of our solar system. So for hundreds of years, when astronomers were thinking about planets around other stars and how they might form and how our planets might have formed, all of their theories were designed to reproduce our solar system, right? Like small rocky planets close to the star, big planets further away. And then when we looked at the stars around us, finally, once our technology got good enough, that's not what we see. We see all of these completely different configurations, gas giants right next to the star, strings of rocky planets that just go on and on and on. It's truly wild what we see. And the exciting thing for me is that nature is just more imaginative than we are. Almost any configuration of planet and star, or planet and multiple stars, or star and multiple planets has we've seen it. It's been made. It's out there. So it's just so cool that actually all of the solar systems we're finding are not like our solar system. So in terms of imagination, you can take just about any planet you can think of and put it in just about any environment you can think of, and that's fine. That's allowed. That's what we see.
I'm writing that down for my DMing needs. This is all valid. I got permission. Jennifer, do you have a favorite, like, weird configuration or variation or thing that you might want to apply in a Wildspace design?
So a thing that I think would be fun to play with are the idea of tidally locked planets. So just like our moon, we only ever see one face of it because it is locked to the Earth. There are planets that are so close into their stars that they've entered this state where one side of the planet is always facing the star and one side is always facing away. And so you can imagine these worlds where it's super hot and you're being blasted by radiation from the sun on one side of the planet, and then the other side is this dark wasteland that's like frozen out and never sees any light from the star. And then we have the Terminator, that like dividing line in between. And so I think the idea of having like separate populations or races that are adapted to these two very different environments, but that only interact in that Terminator region, would be a really cool type of world to develop.
That sounds super fun. Tough choice. Do I burn in the Mercury like environment,
Yeah.
or do I freeze to death in the Plutonian hellscape?
I'm not sure either of them is good.
Chris, you had to answer some of these questions in helping to develop some of these systems that we might run into when we pick up the books that make up Spelljammer Adventures in Space. So without spoiling anything for us, do you have any fun variations already in mind, or inspiration you're going to take, or a pitch for us on what lives on our tidally locked planet?
Well, with a wild space system, you can let your imagination go wild or not. One of the wild space systems that's sort of most well known is Realm Space, the wild space system of the Forgotten Realms. And it is actually very similar to ours. There are rocky planets, kind of small, close to the sun, and then the big boys and girls are kind of farther away. And then we got sort of weird on the outskirts with like, oh, there's a disc-shaped world with a sort of spindle-like mountain. And there's another world that's actually sort of shattered, and it's got basically only being held together by a gigantic plant.
We have disintegrating planets in real life, just by the way. That's actually a real thing.
Really? That's awesome.
Yeah. How do you know they're disintegrating?
How did you know that?
So what we normally see when we look for planets is one of the ways we look for planets is the planet, which is a sphere, usually is going around the star and blocking some of the light. So if you're lined up just right and you just watch the brightness of the star, you see it blink. It gets a little bit dimmer because the planet blocks some of the light, and it makes a very specific shape of a circle going in front of a circle. And it's very periodic. It comes back and happens. So if you're an alien civilization looking at Earth, every 365 days, you see a little shadow of Earth. Now, what we saw when we looked at this white dwarf, which is like a dying star, instead of like a discrete circle going by regularly, just little blips happening irregularly of tiny things. And if you added them all up, it was like a rocky planet that had been shredded into planetismals, and we were just seeing the shreds going around this dying star. So it's a disintegrating planet.
Interesting.
That's real.
And because it's still intermittent, it's that and not like an asteroid field or something like that, right?
Yeah. So the pieces are big enough to, we think, be the body of a dead planet that's been pulled apart by this, by the cataclysm that happened when the star started dying and is now just finishing dying quietly for the rest of the age of the universe.
That's the ordinary facts of your work are so beautiful and poetic that you're just like, slowly dying for the rest of the universe. Like, I need a minute. Chris, what other advice would you have for sort of peopling and populating? If I'm making my own wild space system and I've picked a couple of these things, I know I personally, because I love my D&D Beyond, I will go start looking up monsters by environment type. But what else would you recommend as we're filling out the details for the D&D worlds that live there?
That's a really good question. So in Spelljammer Adventures in Space, we include a bestiary called Boo's Astral Menagerie, which provides a selection of monsters that your players have probably never interacted with before that really kind of fit thematically. But then within that, you as a DM can decide what sort of genre you're playing to, because in Spelljammer, you can kind of play with all sorts of genres. Your session tonight might be very much inspired by cosmic horror. And so you've got some sort of space-dwelling behemoth tentacled monster that's going to, threaten a planet or threaten your heroes. But then the next session, you might be dealing with, merchants in an asteroid city, and those merchants might look like tiny rainbow-colored penguins, and sort of play more toward the whimsical side. So there's a lot of variety there. It's really just an embarrassment of riches, and we encourage DMs to sort of fixate on the sort of feel of the game that they want, identify their genre, and then pick monsters accordingly. And then, of course, there's the wealth of all of the monsters in our core game, which you can skin to be space-dwelling simply by giving them a simple trait like, hey, this monster doesn't need air to survive, or something like that.
Can I add one thing that I think is a cool fact for DMs to use? So when we've been finding all of these planets, one of the things we've discovered is that the most common kind of planet that we found so far is something called a super Earth. So it's bigger than our Earth, but smaller than Neptune. The interesting thing, the implication for DMs choosing creatures is that the gravity on the surface of these planets is much stronger than the gravity on the surface of Earth. So creatures, like giraffes would have trouble on a planet with very high surface gravity because the blood has to get all the way up their necks to their heads. So you could imagine like creatures on these larger planets with the big surface gravity would be really squat and like low down to the ground because the gravity is so strong, and that it's harder to do things like jump and make tall structures because of the gravity.
Right? If they went to a different planet then where the surface gravity is lower, you would have these folks who are just like hulked up because they've been struggling under higher surface gravity for their whole lives.
That's right.
And I'm back in because I get Superman. I'm on board.
So you could have a world that's sort of high gravity and actually dominated by stout dwarves.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in Spelljammer, we have dragons who actually live in suns. Have you seen any of those?
I'm going to let Jen talk about how evil stars are.
Oh, great.
So one of the big challenges we have when searching for new worlds is that you're looking for these minuscule signals that the planets impart on their stars, because we never see the planets themselves. Okay, almost never. Most of the time we're looking at the impact that the planet has on its star. And so you have to detect that signal against the background of the star. And stars are really active. And so stars have spots, like dark spots that come across, and they have plage, which are bright areas that come across. They have flares. And so all of these things complicate our efforts to find these tiny, tiny planet signals. But I can totally imagine a dragon inside a star being the cause of huge flares that blast radiation and energy out into space that then makes its way to your planet, and on our world does things like knock out communication satellites sometimes.
Exactly.
But you can imagine it having a very different flavor, on a planet in the astral sea or in one of these wild spaces.
I will say that I did not call at the start of this conversation that the response you all would have to solar dragons was, that makes sense.
This explains a lot, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what I want to know as someone who's traveling through astral space is, when I see a planet or a ship off in the distance, can I tell if that air is safe before I commit myself to like merging ships or landing on the planet? Because this seems dicey otherwise.
What fun would that be? So a ship has its own air envelope, and other big objects have their envelopes as well. Even a creature just out in space by itself can have its own little envelope. It probably won't sustain the creature for very long. The creature will deplete it pretty quickly. But the ones on board ships and the ones on board planets are constantly replenishing. And so But occasionally you might happen upon, say, an adrift spelljamming ship that has come in contact with some kind of poison or radiation that has tainted its atmosphere. And if your atmosphere interacts with its atmosphere, suddenly yours can become contaminated as well. And that's one of the risks of space travel, and why you might need a spell like Gust of Wind or something to kind of push the bad out and replenish your atmosphere through magic. Planets can likewise have poisonous or toxic atmospheres. One of the tricks to refreshing your poisoned air envelope around your ship is to actually swoop down into the air envelope of a planet that actually has a clean air supply, and you'll sort of solve that problem. But if you land on a planet that doesn't, good luck to you. I hope you have magic like the air bubble spell to protect your head at least, or something like what we call in Spelljammer a fish suit, which is like a deep diving suit but for space. It's our version of an astronaut's regalia.
Sure, but it makes sense because you're in the sea.
So yes, this though is a question.
It looks like a deep diver suit. Yeah.
But I mean, checking if there might be air on this planet is a thing that we sometimes do, right?
Yeah. Once we find a planet, the two main ways that we do this give you two different pieces of information. You learn either about the size of the planet or the mass of the planet. You can put those two pieces of information together if you detect the planet both ways to learn about its density and get an idea of whether or not it might have an atmosphere. And once you've done that, you can do what we call transmission spectroscopy to better understand the atmospheres of planets. And so if you know a planet exists and you know both how big it is and how massive it is, that can give you some information about what the density of the planet is and whether it's likely to have an atmosphere. And so assuming all of those things look good, you do something called transmission spectroscopy, where you watch the planet pass in front of its star and you observe it in a bunch of different wavelengths or in a bunch of different colors. And the idea here is that if there are different gases in the atmosphere, those gases absorb different colors of light. And so if you see a planet where it looks much bigger in the orange colored filter that you're using than the blue colored filter, then that might suggest that there's sodium in the atmosphere of the planet, because sodium absorbs orange light. So it would look opaque. It would look like it's blocking out more of the star's space than the blue filter would. And so we can use this to do things like look for specific elements or molecules. And in particular, folks are always really excited to try and look at small planets and see if there are signs of things like water or oxygen or ozone, all of which we consider as biomarkers or things that might be a sign of a habitable planet that, if you went there, you'd be able to breathe the air.
Have we found a lot of those?
No.
Unfortunately, no. Everything that we found so far will kill you.
I think
that's true for most
Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, fair enough. Actually, these things go well together.
Exciting danger, interesting, gorgeous, varied danger. I was curious, based on that description, actually, and Chris, you can feel free to shut me down at any time, but let's say I wanted to homebrew something for my table. Could I potentially look at magic that relies on color or scrying to maybe get a little air pocket checker outer?
That's really interesting. Like, for instance, we have telescopes in D&D, and magic telescopes might have ranges as big as or greater than what we have now. There's really no limit to that. And thanks to that, you might be able to scan a planet and then use scrying magic to basically, take a closer look from a safe distance. So that would be a very safe, sensible way to explore space. Now, in my experience, players are rarely that safe and sensible.
Yeah. If you force them to first apply for the telescope time and then take the observations and then reduce the data all before they can go to a planet, I can imagine many parties being like, this is not worth it, we'll just go.
Yeah. Precisely. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. There's another item actually that pinged when we were discussing some of the things that might come up in space, actually. Chris, would you tell us about the Wildspace Orrery?
Oh, so the Wildspace Orrery is a magic item that we put in the book, and basically what it functions as is it tells you where you are within any Wildspace system. So if you're on a ship and you want to know what's in the system around you. You can activate this device, and there's like a little light that shows your ship, where your ship is relative to all of the big sort of celestial bodies in that wild space system. So it doesn't extend out into the astral sea, so it's not infinite, which is great. But you can tell at a glance, okay, this system has a sun in its center, and it's got, 15 worlds and 75 moons, and there's something over there. We're not sure what it is, so we're going to go check that out. And that's basically giving you kind of the lay of the land of a wild space system.
And Jennifer, do we have versions of this in real life?
We do, and this is actually a thing that JPL specializes in. So JPL runs the Horizon system, which is an online solar system tracker. And so it contains, I have these numbers written down because they're so large. It has the locations and the trajectories of 1,219,636 asteroids, 3,810 comets, 211 planetary satellites, and then also the 8 planets, the sun, and the spacecraft that we've put into space so far. But yeah, we work really hard to figure out what exists in our solar system and then keep an eye on where it is.
My DM notebook does not have that many pages.
Yeah, good luck if you want a page for each comet.
Yeah, you need your own magic orrery.
One of my greatest fears is getting crushed by a rogue exoplanet, so it's good to know what's passing through.
That's fair.
We would see a rogue exoplanet coming. There are in Spelljammer, there are worlds that can just show up anywhere, and that's actually true of the asteroids in our solar system. So, as Jen said, there's a million asteroids that we found and we're tracking, but it's the asteroids we don't know about that worries NASA. And NASA actually has a planetary defense program, which is dedicated to making sure that a rogue asteroid doesn't just come and surprise us and crush us. And there's actually a job you can apply for, which is a planetary defense officer, which I've always just thought it sounded very, that if you could just have that title, planetary defense officer, very inspiring.
That gives me an idea, actually, for an adventure or a campaign where all of the characters are basically members of a planetary defense force.
That sounds like fun.
I'm already on board.
Although
Except
they're probably
if it was too true to life, they'd just do paperwork. That's all they would do.
They're probably up there in space, actually, fighting the encroaching force, with fireball spells and that kind of thing.
That seems more fun than the real job.
Yeah, the real job is paperwork for sure.
Well, when the comets try to kill you in Spelljammer, they're doing it on purpose. So, speaking of going out and encountering all of these new mysteries, which may or may not try to kill you, I was a little bit curious about some of your understanding of our space environment as it pertains to some of the details in here, like getting around, like the traveling between worlds. I think we had some comments. As a DM, you're going to figure out the sort of closest and furthest distances for things to get around. What is that based in?
Well, in D&D, it's easy. The DM sort of tries to guide the players as best as the DM can. The players will ultimately do their own thing, and the DM then improvises. But the key is to get to the adventure. That's the goal. You're trying to get to the part of the story that's exciting and fun for everybody. And if that means that you cross a great distance of space in 30 seconds of actual real time, then so be it.
I love that, and you've heard that here first. That's official. Please have fun in your games.
Yes.
In our regular world, it's not so easy to move around. What are some of these scales that we're talking about, and is there anything you'd be jealous of about the way we move around in Spelljammer?
So this is the thing that we worry about in doing real mission planning. So because all of the planets are going around the sun in these kind of concentric circles, there are times when planets are closer together than further apart. And so the closest that the Earth and Mars ever really get to each other is something like 35 miles apart. That's still a big distance. If you compare it to the furthest they are, which
35 like million miles, or 35,000 miles, or 35
sorry,
35. You said 35 miles, and I just want to make sure nobody thinks that Earth and Mars get to 35 miles apart, because that would be some science misinformation.
Road trip.
Yeah, right? Give me 20 minutes. I'm there. It's fine. Yeah. No, 35
Okay, so 35, how many? Yes, okay.
35 million miles is the closest we get. The furthest they get is 250 million miles, which is way further away. And the average is something like 140 million miles. And so when you're planning for things like, how much fuel does it take to get to Mars? How much time does it get to take to Mars? Down the road, how long are humans going to be in a spaceship that's trying to get to Mars? You really want to aim for that closest approach. And so that approach happens something like every 26 months or so. And so if you look at the launch schedule for Mars missions, you'll see that they happen, if the budget allows for it, kind of every 2 years. And so there are very specific windows where it's like, we got to go now or we're not going at all for 2 more years because the planets start moving away from each other and all of a sudden there's not enough fuel, there's not enough time.
Yeah, so there was this mission from the 70s called Voyager 2, which traveled to all of the outer giant planets of our solar system. And that there was like this window. The only reason they got that mission funded was because the scientists were like, look, if we go like right now, this decade, all of those giant planets are on the same side of the sun. We can just hop from one to the next to the next. And that configuration doesn't happen very often. It was going to be decades before that would happen again. And so they were like, it's right. The window is right now. We got to go. And they got it funded. And they did this incredible exploration of the outer solar system because it just happened to be that all of the 4 giant planets were lined up in a way that you could hop from one to the next. So it was really, it's very scientifically important that these things happen sometimes.
I feel like there's a helpful design principle there for me and my future DMing and playing, where if I need people to do things in a hurry, I got to arrange it to be like, the universe is literally only giving you this window. We have to get this done.
And it's a scientifically sound principle.
Yeah.
And it's one of the best travel words, which is syzygy, for how those line up. SYZY, GY, I think, or something.
Yeah, there was an X-Files episode called that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all about planetary alignment.
That's what it's called.
Yeah. That's great. I love that because in D&D, you often have to, as a DM, invent an impetus or a time pressure to get the players to act. And so if they know that this is kind of their one shot, and after this, the planets themselves are going to be against them, then that's a great incentive.
I'm already very inspired to help fill out my space adventures with some extra details. Maybe surf through a catalog for some inspiration. Maybe appreciate being able to cross long distances and not have to do all of the math myself when I'm DMing. But I'm curious if there's anything else that jumped out at y'all. Is there anything that you, as a person, as a D&D player, is there something about Spelljammer you find exciting, Jennifer?
Just the variety, I think. Like exactly as Jessie was saying earlier, any type of planet you can imagine, there is probably a physical basis for it somewhere in the galaxy, if not the universe. And so I think that just takes so many bounds off of what we, normally limit ourselves to thinking about. And so go wild, like incorporate any cool, crazy, weird aspect of a world that you can think of, and you have the sign off of folks who think about exoplanets to say, yeah, it probably exists.
That's beautiful. Jessie?
Yeah, so absolutely, definitely the variety. And then the fun thing about space is you can tell any kind of story in space, right? Space is just the setting. And like people call Star Wars a sci-fi movie, but it's just a space opera. It's just in space, right? It's not really a sci-fi. There's no sci-fi babble. So the exciting thing is that you can tell any story there, right? It's just a cool new place to tell the stories you love, the stories about people and their journeys and their highs and lows and victories and defeats. You just get to tell them in space now with this new exciting thing. So that's what I'm excited about, because obviously I love space.
Oh, that's really beautiful, Chris.
I love the idea that as a DM or a player, there is a science at play. Even in the world, even in the multiverse of D&D, there's sort of certain physics and scientific rules that apply. But if you're not a science expert, or if science seems to fail you, you have in D&D magic to lean on as sort of an explanation for the unexplainable. And I think that that's very liberating. And so you can enjoy a space-based adventure and not get concerned or wrapped up about what can't be, and just sort of embrace the possibility.
I love that's beautiful. So rules always allow us to have surprise, they allow us to have danger, they allow us to create interesting challenges, but it is a big wild universe in the real world, and I am hearing it can be even bigger and wilder as much as your imagination will fit in Spelljammer. Spelljammer Adventures in Space is going to come out on Tuesday, August 16th, so you can play through some incredible spacefaring adventures. I would love if y'all would please tell me where people can find you, and maybe if folks got intrigued by some of this exoplanet talk, if you have a recommendation on where they could learn more about our universe. Jennifer?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. I'm not very good at tweeting, I will admit that up front, but at AstroGenB, and I occasionally say things about planets. Jessie's much better at this than I am. But yeah, if you Google NASA exoplanets, and what is it, Eyes on Exoplanets, I think is the specific program. There's an amazing website that our comms folks have set up that will teach you all about the ways we look for exoplanets, the kinds of exoplanets we've found so far, what missions are flying to look for new exoplanets right now. So definitely encourage you to go check that out.
Incredible. Jessie, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Aussie Astronomer. I was going to say Eyes on Exoplanets too, because that's NASA's very, very cool resource that they've spent a lot of time developing. And I'm going to plug, it actually pulls data from the Exoplanet Archive to populate this amazing 3D visual. So that's my service. So we're helping make that happen. That's a really cool resource to go and check out. So yeah, I would also say Eyes on Exoplanets, sorry.
Perfect. With that data that you definitely are not making up as you go.
On the up and up, 100%.
There's also some, if you go on, I was just poking around on the site, and there's actually some great ideas for character names embedded in the website. Like I'm thinking about calling my next autognome Wobble.
Yes.
Perfect. Chris, any last words of inspiration about going to space and drawing those facts from the real world to color our fantasy adventures?
Not beyond what we've already talked about. I think that this is a DM's playground. This setting that we've created really opens up possibilities for storytelling, and I look forward to hearing about all of your spacefaring adventures and the wacky things that you discover. And you can find me not in outer space but in cyberspace at Twitter. My account is Chris Perkins D&D.
Thank you all so much for your time, for your expertise, and for inspiring mine, and I'm guessing many people's future space adventures. We will see you next time on D&D Beyond.